Rescue efforts have ended today after divers removed 4 more members of a youth soccer team from a cave in Thailand. 8 of the boys have now been freed. They range in age from 11 to 16.
4 boys and their 25-year-old coach remain trapped inside. The team has been stranded since June 23rd. Dr. Jessy Warner-Cohen is a health psychologist at the Long Island Jewish Medical Center. She joins us now with more on the possible psychological effects that these children could experience. So we've been talking about this, Doctor, all morning long. Clearly, the medical professionals on the ground there want to ensure that the kids and their coach, when they are rescued, are in good physical condition. But talk about some of the worries that you would have if you were to examine them and thinking about their future.
Absolutely. So they've been put in a completely foreign and terrifying situation. They were in the dark for days without knowing what would happen. So the uncertainty, the physical stress on them also affects your thinking. So the hypothermia, the lack of nutrition, all filters, everything filters through that lens. So not thinking the same way they usually would. So everything is kind of through that prism right now. And how they understand that coming out of it can really be concerning.
So obviously they're experiencing trauma now, presently. Some of them have been released from the hospital, but I'm thinking about sort of the long-term trauma and specifically the age at which they're experiencing this trauma, because I know it's different if you're talking about a 5-year-old versus a 25-year-old versus an 11 to 16-year-old. Absolutely.
So this is the age where kids try to form their own self-independent identity. And that's really going to be affected by the experiences that they had here. The camaraderie on one hand, but also the trauma on the other, and how that plays out over time. And also being caught in this really foreign situation. My understanding is that none of them knew how to swim, and suddenly you're surrounded by water. So that's an overwhelming experience for a lot of people.
It's something that we may be getting into a larger discussion here about psychology, but I wonder, given that there's a 25-year-old coach with them, from the reporting that our Ben Tracy has provided to us, he's been the one that's been sort of keeping their spirits alive and keeping their hopes alive because he's an adult and because he's the leader of that team. But adults process trauma and stress differently than children. And I just wonder if there's going to be a difference in how you would treat the children versus how you might treat the soccer coach. Because if you know how dangerous it is, okay, so the kids have never gone swimming before, but you can tell a kid, look, it's going to be an adventure, it's going to be fun, and on the other side, you're going to see your parents, and the kid goes, all right, I got no problem with that. An adult is going to say, wait a second, I could die.
Yeah, and the amount of guilt of being the leader in this is, I can imagine, is overwhelming. But on the other hand, there's decades of research on child resiliency, and if there's one adult that can be a great example, if there's one adult that can lead them through, that shows that they can be resilient, have improved resiliency lifelong. So having that adult there can also be a tremendous benefit for the children. The soccer coach, as a psychologist, my heart goes out to him in terms of the amount of stress and guilt that I can imagine that he's experiencing right now.
For sure.
How could this trauma, though, resurface? We've been watching video of the boys, shortly after being found, and everyone has been commenting on how healthy they look, how they're smiling. But when I was watching that, I thought, yeah, I would be smiling too if I thought maybe rescuers were here and I would be, I would be getting home to my parents imminently. But 6 months from now, 7 months, 3 years from now, how might this trauma resurface in a way that maybe is not as recognizable as we might think?
Yeah, we see a lot of lifelong effects of trauma. So there are things that happen immediately, and that could be sleeplessness, trouble with some of the triggers, like being in dark spaces or being someplace enclosed. But then as you progress through life, and especially now that we're in the age where they're still developing, it can really help form who they are as a person. Some people become more extroverted, some people become more introverted, and there's this effect on it also in times of stress. So I would imagine that as life goes on, in times of stress, they may be re-triggered as well. There's also in your brain the place that stores traumatic memories and sensations are right next to each other. So things like a smell, a certain sight, a sound can be triggering really lifelong, and it's working through the issues now and having access to services throughout their life so that they can join that kind of support is really going to be important.
Oh, that's fascinating.
One of the things we've also talked about is faith, religious faith, spirituality. What kind of a role does that play in the way people process trauma?
It's, you know, it really puts a lens on the entire situation and how you understand the world. So you can understand this in terms of this was a situation that was given to me by a higher power, and I'm going to understand that they're going to look out for me. So they can be very protective. On the other hand, people sometimes can get very angry and say, I believe in this higher power, I believe in God, why didn't they protect me? So we can kind of go either way, but there's really a sense of social connectedness amongst this group, and that can be tremendously positive. So if you notice their notes that came out, they were really asking about their family, they were talking about the other kids, so they're really very connected, and that connectedness can be a really strong part of recovery.
You know, it's interesting, talking about how you process trauma and situations like this. One of the great books, one of my favorite books that I always sort of try to read it every couple of years, is Viktor Frankl's The Meaning of Life. And one of the things that I honed in on, because I just thought it was so simple yet so interesting, that one of the theories that he has about why some people survive in difficult situations and others don't is just having something to live for. Just the idea that if you get out of the situation that you're in. I remember there was an example that he gave about, you know, in a concentration camp, there was one guy there who was like, you know, there's some guy out there who owes me $200 and I'm going to get it. Like, and that's enough to keep them going. Through the things that are unimaginable. How much of a role does that kind of, I know it sounds cheesy for a lot of people, but positive thinking?
There's a tremendous amount of beneficial effects of positive thinking in traumatic situations, difficult situations, and in everyday life. It really can reframe the way you think, and actually reframe the way your brain works as well.
Really?
So even amongst...
So there's evidence that your brain can be rewired by thinking this way.
Oh, absolutely. In a much more benign example, athletes, they really engaging in positive thinking. I can, you know, I'm going to score this goal. I'm going to get this basket. I'm going to finish this race. Can change the way your whole body works, the tension in your body, oxygen flow, and that affects your thinking and your behavior. So there's a tremendous positive effect of this positive thinking.
I thought what you also said about their letters was pretty significant. You know, I'm a big podcast person, right? And I listened to a podcast recently about how you deal with grief and trauma. And the scientists that they studied said, you know, you can tell when how people are going to deal with trauma when they focus on I versus others. And the fact that they were focused on how are you guys doing and how the story sort of affected the others was a good indicator versus, you know, woe is me, what has happened to me, why is this happening to me?
Absolutely. It's that external view of the world rather than the internal. Even joking about teachers and homework. So they're looking forward to going back to school.
Let me ask you just quickly about the parents, though. This would, if I was experiencing this, it would probably change the way that I parent forever. They're experiencing a level of trauma as well.
Absolutely. It's a communal trauma for the kids, for the families, for their communities, their peers. Everyone's going through their own levels of trauma with this, and it's going to be difficult, and having someone guide them in terms of, yes, you want to protect them and you probably never want to let your son out of your sight again, but that you can't do that either, and how do you manage that is really going to be a difficult and ongoing process, I can imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Jessy Warner-Cohen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor.